Forget memorizing formulas and definitions. There is a method so simple that even Nobel-winning physicists like Richard Feynman swear by it, and it rewires your brain for understanding, not just recall. But before we get there, I want to ask you something honestly. When was the last time you sat down to study something important, something you genuinely needed to understand, and within 20 minutes you found yourself staring at the ceiling, or checking your phone, or suddenly remembering that you needed to reorganize your desk? I'm not asking to make you feel guilty. I'm asking because that moment, that quiet drift away from the page, might be one of the most misunderstood experiences in all of education. The frustration. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that does not feel like exhaustion. It does not come from running a marathon or lifting heavy things. It comes from sitting still, reading words you technically understand, and somehow retaining nothing. You reach the bottom of a page and realize you have no idea what you just read, so you go back to the top. You read it again and again. And somewhere in that loop, a voice starts talking. It is quiet at first. It says things like, maybe you are not built for this. Maybe some people just get it, and you are one of the people who does not. Maybe discipline is something others were given and somehow skipped you. That voice is not telling you the truth, but it sounds very convincing when you're sitting alone at a desk at 9 o'clock at night. Here's what nobody tells you, though. That moment of drift, that inability to focus, that feeling of information sliding off your brain like water off glass, it's not a character flaw. It's actually a signal. And if you learn to read it differently, it stops being evidence of your failure and starts being information about how your mind actually works. Society has spent a very long time teaching us that the people who struggle to memorize are the slow ones, and the people who can absorb information quietly and quickly are the intelligent ones. We built entire school systems around that idea. We gave grades for recall. We timed tests. We told children that understanding could be measured in 30-minute increments. What we missed is that the human brain was never designed for passive absorption. It was designed for active construction. There's a difference, and that difference explains almost everything. There is a deeply held belief in our culture that intelligence is something you either possess or you lack, that talented people learn fast, and struggling means something is wrong with you. This belief is so embedded that most people don't even question it. They simply accept it as fact and arrange their self-image around it. But here's the quiet problem with that story. When psychologists actually study learning, when they sit inside classrooms and laboratories and follow people across months and years, they find something surprising. The students who struggle early and push through that struggle often develop far deeper understanding than the students for whom it came easily. Not always, but often enough to matter. The reason is something we might call desirable difficulty. When the brain works hard to retrieve or construct an idea, it builds stronger neural pathways than when information is simply given and received. Struggle, in other words, is often the mechanism of growth rather than the evidence of its absence. Howard Gardner spent decades arguing that intelligence is not one single thing. It's a collection of different capacities: linguistic, logical, spatial, musical, interpersonal, bodily, naturalistic. When we compress all of that into a single test score and call it smart or not smart, we're not measuring intelligence. We're measuring how well someone performs on that specific narrow task, in that specific format, on that specific day. Benjamin Bloom, one of the most important educational psychologists of the 20th century, drew a map of how understanding actually deepens over time. At the base of his map was simple recall, knowing a fact, but above that were layers that most classroom education never reaches: applying, analyzing, evaluating, creating. The tragedy is not that students cannot climb that map, it's that most of them were never shown it existed. So when you sit at a desk and information fails to stick, the question worth asking is not, am I intelligent enough? The question is, am I being asked to memorize or am I being invited to understand? Those are very different experiences, and only one of them actually works. Enter Feynman. Feynman won the Nobel Prize in physics. He could have spent his life communicating through equations and academic papers, and nobody would have blamed him. But Feynman was obsessed with something else entirely. He was obsessed with whether he truly understood something. He developed a habit, or perhaps a discipline, though he might have called it just thinking clearly, of testing his own knowledge in the most ruthless way possible. He would take an idea, any idea, and try to explain it as if he were teaching it to someone who had never encountered it before. Not a colleague, not a student, a curious child, someone with no assumed vocabulary, no shared shorthand, no tolerance for jargon. What Feynman discovered over and over again is that when he couldn't explain something simply, it revealed exactly where his understanding had gaps, not where it was incomplete, but where it was hollow, where he had learned the language of an idea without learning the idea itself. This distinction changes everything. You can memorize the definition of entropy without ever truly feeling what entropy is. You can repeat the formula for compound interest without ever understanding why it surprises people, why it builds quietly and then suddenly overwhelms. You can know the word photosynthesis without understanding that a leaf is quietly performing chemistry all day long, turning light into sugar, doing work so subtle you'd never notice it unless someone stopped and made you look. Feynman's technique, which has become known as the Feynman Technique, though he never called it that, has 4 movements. You choose something to understand. You explain it as if teaching someone who knows nothing. You find the places where your explanation breaks down, or goes vague, or reaches for jargon. And then you go back to the source and fill those gaps, not by rereading the same paragraph, but by constructing a cleaner explanation. It sounds almost too simple, and that's exactly why most people don't do it. We're drawn to complexity because complexity feels like effort. If we're reading dense text and highlighting and making organized notes, it feels like work. It feels like studying. But feeling like studying and actually learning are 2 very different things. Psychologists call this fluency illusion, the sense that because something is familiar, we must know it. We confuse recognition with understanding. We reread the same chapter and feel more confident, not because we understand more, but because the words look less foreign. The Feynman technique breaks that illusion cleanly. You can't fake your way through explaining something to an imaginary 8-year-old. Either you understand it or you don't. Either the explanation flows or it stalls, and when it stalls, you know exactly where to dig. The deeper architecture.
What Feynman was doing intuitively, modern neuroscience is now beginning to map in detail. When you learn something passively, reading without engaging, listening without connecting, your brain places that information in a kind of temporary holding space. It is there, technically, but it has not been woven into anything. It sits alone, unconnected to other things you know. And isolated information does not last. It fades quickly, because the brain, in its relentless efficiency, tends to discard what it does not use or connect. Think of memory like a garden. A fact dropped into the soil without roots does not grow. But when an idea is connected to something you already know, something you have questioned or struggled with or used, when it brushes up against your existing understanding and creates a small friction, it takes root. It becomes part of something, and things that are part of something are much harder to lose. This is why teaching is one of the most powerful learning strategies ever discovered, not because the teacher is noble or generous, but because the act of organizing information clearly enough to explain it requires the same kind of active construction that builds deep memory. You cannot teach what you do not understand, so the very pressure of teaching forces understanding. You do not need a classroom or a student for this. You need a blank page and honesty. Write an explanation. Talk it out loud in a quiet room. Draw a diagram of how one idea connects to another. The format matters less than the activity, the active wrestling with material, the refusal to accept vague familiarity as enough. Bloom understood something similar when he noticed that the students who scored highest on evaluations were not always the ones who had studied most. They were often the ones who had spent the most time at the upper levels of his map, creating, arguing, applying. The act of making something with knowledge is what deepens it. This is not just pedagogy. This is how brains consolidate memory during sleep, how they build meaning from experience, how they slowly turn encounters into understanding. There is also something worth naming about how emotions shape this process. William James, who might fairly be called the first American psychologist, noticed over 100 years ago that attention is not neutral. What we attend to, we shape, and what we shape, we become. When you bring genuine curiosity to a subject, when you are not just trying to pass a test, but actually wondering how something works, something opens. The material stops being an obstacle and starts being an invitation. Curiosity does not require you to find every subject fascinating. It only asks you to ask one honest question. What is actually happening here? Why does this work? What would change if it were different? One question is enough to shift the mode from passive absorption to active inquiry. And active inquiry is the only mode in which deep learning actually occurs. Let us talk about resistance for a moment, because it deserves more than dismissal. There is a version of resistance that is actually wisdom. When your mind refuses to engage with material that has been presented in a way that does not make contact with anything you already know, that is not laziness. That is a signal that the bridge has not been built yet. You cannot integrate new information into nothing. You need an anchor. You need a question, a connection, a context. Without those, information does not land. The mind wanders not because it is weak, but because it is searching for the door. But there is another kind of resistance, and it is worth being honest about. It is the kind that looks like rest and feels like rest, but is actually avoidance. It's the third coffee break, the fifth scroll through the same feed, the rearranging of notes already organized. It is not that rest is wrong. Rest is genuinely essential. Memory consolidates during rest. Sleep, in particular, does extraordinary things to freshly learned material, weaving it into long-term storage in ways that wakefulness cannot match. Real rest is not the enemy of learning. It is part of the mechanism. But avoidance dressed as rest carries a different quality. You can usually feel it if you're honest. Rest leaves you refreshed. Avoidance leaves you with a slight coating of guilt, a residue of unease, a sense that time has slipped without being used. If you pay attention to that difference, you stop needing to judge yourself for it. You simply notice it and choose. Carl Jung wrote about the shadow not as something to be destroyed, but as something to be understood. The part of us that avoids, the part that procrastinates, the part that cannot focus, it is not the enemy. It often carries something worth examining. Sometimes avoidance is protecting you from fear of failure. Sometimes it is quietly asking whether the goal you're working towards is even yours, or whether you absorbed it from someone else's expectations. These are not small questions. So what does it actually look like to study like Feynman, not as a productivity hack, but as a genuine practice of understanding? It begins with selecting less. Most students try to cover everything. Feynman was interested in depth. He would rather understand one thing completely than recognize 10 things vaguely.
This is a harder and slower approach, and it feels less productive in the short term, but it compounds. Real understanding, once built, does not leave. It becomes the scaffolding on which the next layer of understanding rests. It continues with explanation as the test, not rereading, not re-highlighting, closing the book and asking yourself to reconstruct the idea from the inside out. Where does the explanation flow? Where does it go blurry? Where do you reach for the word you memorized instead of the meaning behind it? Those blurry places are not failures. They are the exact locations where further learning should happen. It deepens with connection. Once you can explain something simply, begin asking where it appears elsewhere. How does this concept relate to something you already know well? What question does it answer that you have had in a different context? Connection is how the brain builds architecture rather than accumulate clutter. Isolated facts are heavy and forgettable. Connected ideas are light and durable. And it requires patience with the pace. Marcus Aurelius, who was in many ways a student of his own mind, wrote in his private journal that you have power over your mind, not outside events. Understand this and you will find strength. He was not talking about control in the rigid sense. He was talking about the power of directing attention deliberately, of choosing where the mind rests, of refusing to be carried by habit into distraction. Learning is not a performance, it is a private practice. Its results are invisible for a long time before they are visible. The gardener doesn't pull the plant up to see if the roots are growing. They tend the conditions and trust the process. Here's what all of this comes down to. You've probably been taught that knowing means being able to recall, that studying means covering material, that intelligence is fixed, that discipline is a personality trait, and that if understanding doesn't come quickly, something is wrong with you. None of that is accurate. Understanding is built, not absorbed. It is constructed through active engagement, honest examination, genuine curiosity, and the willingness to sit with confusion long enough for clarity to arrive. Feynman did not become brilliant by memorizing more. He became brilliant by refusing to pretend he understood something when he didn't. He made honesty about his own knowledge a practice, and that practice deepened everything. The one thing worth carrying from this video is simple. You do not need to know more. You need to understand what you already know and build carefully from there. Depth over coverage, explanation over memorization, honesty over the performance of knowing. That's not a study tip, it's a way of relating to your own mind. If this idea landed somewhere real for you, sit with it before moving on. Ask yourself one question honestly, not as a judgment, but as genuine curiosity. In the subject you're working on right now, what is one thing you recognize but do not yet truly understand? That question is the beginning. In the next video, we're going to go deeper into why our brains forget the things we most want to remember, and how memory actually works when you stop fighting it and start working with it. It's a conversation worth having, especially if you've ever studied hard for something and watched it disappear the moment the test was over. The deeper questions raised here have more to say, and so do you if you're willing to keep looking.